Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I'm back again today doing another video. The subject of today's video is going to be specifically on the New Orleans Hornets. Yes, the New Orleans Hornets, not the New Orleans Pelicans, not the Charlotte Hornets, the New Orleans Hornets, which that team in that era can essentially be summed up as Chris Paul. The Chris Paul era in New Orleans. It went from 2005 to 2011 when he was then traded away to the Los Angeles Clippers. That era produced 3 playoff appearances, 2 first-round exits, and 1 second-round exit. But it did produce one season, 2007 to 2008, where the uh, New Orleans Hornets had the third best record in the NBA, yet still went home in the second round. Today, I am going to be discussing this specific team, the Chris Paul era in New Orleans, and why they basically were just a lot less impressive than people thought that they would be, and why they ultimately broke up, and just why they didn't find as much success as people thought that they might initially when you had this young, nice core of Tyson Chandler, David West, Chris Paul all working together. So let's get into it. So to start, as a little bit of background, this team was a decent team around the early 2000s. They moved to New Orleans in 2002 to 2003, and they still had Baron Davis on board. And then from around 2002 to 2000, really to about 2004, so 2002 to 2003, and then 2003 to 2004, they were actually a pretty good team. They made the second round 1 year of the playoffs. They made the first round 1 year. They were still led by a combination of um, PJ Brown, Baron Davis, who's still right in the heart of his prime, Jamal Mashburn. So they were a good team at this point, and basically the end of that era was a result of Baron Davis getting sick and tired of the Hornets, and then they traded him to the Warriors for next to nothing. So then that era sort of came to an end. And then the 2004 to 5 season comes along, and a lot of the guys that were on the team, like Jamal Mashburn, left at that point, and then their 2 best players had left, and they were basically left with PJ Brown and David West as their core, so to speak. And so David West was really inexperienced at this time, and they still had other guys sometimes starting in front of him, so he wasn't very productive at all. And this resulted in an 18-win season. So they got a really high draft pick, of course, and they got the 3rd pick, in which they took Chris Paul, which was at the time a really good choice because they didn't have anyone to man the offense, and he was the quarterback, the point guard, and he could direct things and had really good court vision and scoring ability. So he was a natural pick, and he was going to fill the Baron Davis void and bring this New Orleans team back to relevance. So going into the next season, 2005 to 6, you had New Orleans take a big jump up. They improved by 20 games, I believe. Yes, they went from 18 wins to 38 wins. Chris Paul played in 78 games, David West 74. They still had PJ Brown, who played in 75 games as a starter, and then they rounded out that core, if you'd like to call it that, with Desmond Mason, who was on the back end of his career, and Speedy Claxton, who was also just basically a role player. So as some numbers here, Chris Paul in his rookie year averaged 16 points, 8 assists a game, 5 rebounds, 2 steals. He shot 43% from the field and 28% from 3, so not great. And then David West really broke out of his shell. He averaged 17 points per game, 7 rebounds, 1 block, and 1 steal a game. And he shot 51% from the field, so that was good. And then the role players basically did what role players do. PJ Brown, 9 points and 7 rebounds a game. Desmond Mason, 11 points a game. Speedy Claxton, 12 points a game. So by no means were they a great team at this point, but they did have 2 really nice young pieces in David West and Chris Paul, and they were definitely trending in the right direction, you would say. And so this next season that we have, 2006 to 7, they still were sort of in that middle ground where they weren't a bad team, but they also weren't a good team. They didn't have enough surrounding pieces still, and they still needed Chris Paul and David West to continue to develop a little bit more and get a little bit better. And so this season did see the acquisition of Tyson Chandler, which is a really good addition. PJ Brown left the team at this point, and LeBron Chandler, who essentially was the same type of player as PJ Brown, going to score about 10 points a game and get about 10 rebounds a game with some rim protection. They also still had Desmond Mason, and they brought in actually at the end of the season Peja Stojakovic for basically nothing. They got him for which was nice. And he started the last 13 games of the season for them and was an immediate impact player. If you don't remember, at this time, Peja Stojakovic was still like right in the heart of his prime, having come from the Sacramento Kings, where he was basically the best player on the team at that point, him and Mike Bibby. But the Kings were just looking to offload and retool and rebuild a little bit, so they got rid of him, and um, that's how he ended up on New Orleans, if you were wondering at all. But as for this team, just to read off some numbers, Chris Paul, pretty similar to the year before, 17 points per game, 9 assists, 2 steals again, 4 rebounds. His shooting got a little bit better, 44% compared to 42, and his three-point shooting shot up from 28% the previous season and his rookie year up to 35%. And then you had David West, who is basically putting up the same type of numbers, but again, slightly better. 18 points per game, 8 rebounds, one steal, 1 block, 48% from the field. Tyson Chandler, 10 points a game, 12 rebounds, 2 blocks a game. And then you actually had a much better supporting cast than I really realized now that I look at it. You had Bobby Jackson, who played 56 games. He also came out, let's see here. They had gotten him in the offseason. He scored 11 points per game. Razul Butler, he scored 10 points per game this year. Devin Brown scored 12. Desmond Mason scored 14, and he started 75 games for them, which is really good. And then right at the end, when Peja came to the team, he only played in 13 games, but he was scoring 18 points per game, shooting over 40% from the three-point line, so he was definitely contributing. And this was basically the team where they said, okay, we got Peja. He was a little injured towards the end of the season, but we got a lot of good pieces in place, and we're looking that next year with a core of Tyson Chandler, David West, Chris Paul, and Peja Stojakovic, we can really make some waves in the NBA if they all stay healthy. And so next we have the 2007 to 2008 season, which is the season in which New Orleans had the third best record in the league. And yes, that is not a mistake. They did have the third best record with 56 wins, which was very impressive. Excuse me, fourth best record now that I look at it. The Pistons were about 2 games better than them. But still, second best in the West, which is really impressive for the time. And this was a really competitive year in the West as well. All the teams that made the playoffs were separated by only 7 games, from 57 wins to 50. But New Orleans, out of all those teams, was the 2 seed in the West, which is crazy to think. So in the first round, they got past Dallas, and they did that relatively easily. Dallas was still a good team, but they had kind of lost some of their pieces from their 67 win season the year before. Like they still had Josh Howard and Jason Terry, but a lot of those like older vets who had been supporting role players on the team were gone, so that hurt them a little. And in the super competitive Western Conference, like being 1 game worse than somebody meant you could go from like the 2 seed to like the 6 seed, and that's sort of what happened to Dallas, and that they were only 3 wins worse than the 4 seed, but they were the 7, which is really crazy to think about. Whereas normally they would be like the 5 instead of the 7, but they, along with acquiring Jason Kidd for Devin Harris, they just had some like adjustment issues with getting the team rolling, and so they were just sort of looking at it as not a rebuilding season but a retooling season. And New Orleans was on full throttle at this point, so it's no surprise that they won. And as I said earlier, they did have the full healthy season like they were wanting to have. Chris Paul played in 80 games, David West 76, Peja Stojakovic 77, Tyson Chandler 79, and then they brought in 2 new guys to be supporting pieces in Morris Peterson, who's played 76 games. And then Bonzi Wells missed most of the season actually at 22. He only played in 22 games, but I believe he did play in the playoffs. Let me check here. Yes, he did play in all the playoff games, so he was a good factor there. And then they also still had Bobby Jackson being a good supporting piece. So just to read off some stats quick, both David West and Chris Paul had the best years of their careers to this point. Chris Paul averaged 21 points per game, 12 assists, 4 rebounds, 3 steals a game, shot 49% from the field and 37% from 3, by far his best efficiencies to this point in his career. David West had 21 points per game, 9 rebounds, 1 steal, 1 block. As I said previously, he's had those every year almost now. 48% from the field. Peja Stojakovic scored 16 points per game, shooting 44% from three, which is extremely impressive. Tyson Chandler averaged 12 points and 12 rebounds per game, along with one block, and he shot 62% from the field, which is great efficiency. And then you had the supporting piece, Morris Peterson, rounding out the starting lineup, who averaged 8 points per game, shot 39% from three, which is really good. And then off the bench, Bobby Jackson, who scored 7 points per game. And they didn't really have much bench scoring or help whatsoever, but that starting lineup was performing perfectly. And just the fact that those main four guys, Stojakovic, Chandler, Chris Paul, and David West, the fact that they were all playing at a minimum of 76 games or more, that really contributed to this team's success. And you'll see later on how the number of games that these people played really impacted things. So in the next round, they played um, San Antonio, who had, of course, the core of Tony Parker, Bruce Bowen, Manu Ginobili, Tim Duncan, and they were coming off of a championship, and they were seasoned vets. They knew playoff basketball well. Chris Paul and David West were still relatively young players. Even same with Tyson Chandler, who was only at 25 at this time. Um, and yes, they had Peja Stojakovic, but he wasn't the when we say Peja Stojakovic, he was still in some of the better years of his career, but he wasn't prime Peja anymore. In that, like the best version of Peja Stojakovic we saw around 2001, 2002, 2003. This was 2008 Peja, so he wasn't 24, 25 anymore. He was 30. He was still a good player, as I say. He had good numbers, good efficiency, all that, but he was a little bit older, and if they had 2002 Peja Stojakovic, this may have been a different story, because this series between New Orleans and San Antonio, it went to 7, and New Orleans was close to going to the Western Conference Finals, but ultimately San Antonio just had the better players. Honestly, Tim Duncan was the best player in the series, arguably with Chris Paul. But then you go down the line, Parker and Ginobili are probably, you'd say, better than Stojakovic and David West in this series, and then Bruce Bowen's better than Tyson Chandler as far as being a good defender and all that. And so Spurs were also a much better defensive team. Yes, New Orleans had really good rim protection and Chris Paul, but Stojakovic and David West weren't really notable defenders, so to speak. David West was average, and Stojakovic was basically bad. And Morris Peterson was average too, but as far as on San Antonio, you had Bruce Bowen, first team all defense previously. Tim Duncan, like double digit years as a first team defender. Uh, Tony Parker, who was a really underrated but really good defender. So you just had better defense, but San Antonio also had enough offense where they were able to overcome New Orleans on that side as well. So New Orleans had a great season, 56 wins, and they were looking to build on that going into the next year. And a lot of people were looking to them as a team that was going to continue to improve, as Chris Paul was still a young player. Let's see here. Chris Paul was still 22 at the time. So, by the time he was 25, 26, people expected this team to be really good. Okay, and also a quick note, there's a big controversy, not a big controversy, but a point that still gets talked about a fair amount these days, that a lot of people would argue that Chris Paul deserved MVP over Kobe Bryant, in that like New Orleans was expected to be like a 500 team, and they won 56 games, only one worse than Kobe, who had a pretty good core of Pau Gasol, Lamar Odom, and Andrew Bynum. But I think when you consider that Kobe's team had only won like 44 games the year before, being the leading team in the Western Conference is still good enough that he deserved it, I think. But that could be a discussion for another time. Okay, so going into the next season, 2008 to 2009, New Orleans was still a good team, still a playoff contender, but let's see here. They won 49 games, so a little bit of a dip, and they were the 7th seed in the West. But if they would have only won 4 more games, they would have been the 5th seed, and it was still a really tight race, as the 2 seed through the 8 seed was only divided by 6 games. So I mean, the big thing for New Orleans was like dropping 1 or 2 games here and there really made a huge difference in that. It could be the difference between, say, the 2 seed and the 7 seed. But again, just to stress that this was a time where there was a lot of parity in the West, and just a lot of good teams. You had about 8 to 9 legit good teams in the conference at this point. Like, just for instance, Phoenix won 46 games and didn't make the playoffs. The year before this, Golden State won 48 and didn't make the playoffs. So it was a very competitive conference at the time. And so, as I was saying earlier with the injury stuff, this is the first season where it started to come up. Um, so Tyson Chandler's the big issue here. He missed half the season. Their rim protector, their shot blocker, their big man in the post, their basically the anchor of the defense missed half the season. He did average 9 and 9 when he was playing, but just it did definitely impact the team. Chris Paul and David West were healthy, which was good. Chris Paul put up his best statistical season to this point. He averaged 23 points per game, 11 assists, 3 steals a game, over 50% from the field, 36% from three, so very good numbers. And then David West averaged 21 and 9, and then he shot 47%, so again, pretty good. Um, as far as supporting pieces, Razul Butler started in place of Morris Peterson, Morris Peterson was he was their starter in the previous season, but he also missed half the year and really just wasn't healthy even during the time he was playing. But the team replaced him and Bonzi Wells and Bobby Jackson. They basically replaced those three guys with um, a combination of Razul Butler, who filled in fairly nicely at starting small forward, and then James Posey as their sixth man off the bench. Those two combined scored 20 points per game, about 42% from the field, and both shooting about 38% from three. Um, so just good supporting players, but again, as I say, like Peja Stojakovic missing 20 games was big in a Western Conference race that was super tight. Tyson Chandler and Morris Peterson missing half the season was huge in a race that was super tight. Like if all these guys were healthy, the New Orleans could have pretty easily been the 2 seed again, because that would probably be equivalent to them being about at least about 5 wins better, and that would put them at the 2 seed in the West. So injuries were a big part in the issues that they had this season. In the playoffs, they faced Denver, who was a pretty good team at this point. Melo in his prime, Chauncey Billups playing really well. Let's see here. So they had basically all the guys healthy for the playoffs, but Tyson Chandler was playing but not super healthy. He was only playing about 22 minutes per night instead of his usual like 33, so you could tell that there were some nagging issues there. And basically New Orleans just played well, but Denver just played better, which happens sometimes. You say Chris Paul and Carmelo kind of neutralize each other. Same with David West and Chauncey Billups. But then the difference was the supporting cast of Denver played a lot better than the supporting cast of New Orleans in that, like, Peja Stojakovic had an awful series. He shot 37% from the field and only 30% from three and only scored 11 points per game, so he was really not playing very well for them. Same with James Posey, who was averaging 25 minutes a night and shooting 37% from the field and 26% from three, numbers that were way down from what he was doing during the regular season. So this season, they struggled from a combination of a few injuries that were pretty key and then role players just falling short in the playoffs. And again, Page is getting a bit older here at this point in the New Orleans tenure and just in his career in general. So now we're on to 2009 to 2010, which is the next season in which this was the season where there were glimpses that all may not be well in New Orleans, and that things I don't want to say that there were rumblings of trading Chris Paul, but he was definitely not happy in New Orleans, or that was starting to become apparent from the early playoff exit the year before, and even the year before that, when a lot of people thought that they could have even gone to the finals and they lost in the second round. But anyway, going into this season, they were still hopeful that they could be a contending team and go relatively far, second round or conference finals. But again, the West was really tight. The 1 seed to the 8 seed was divided by 7 games, and every team that made the playoffs had 50 wins. So again, super tight and basically no margin for error as far as contending and trying to get into the playoffs, and that's where it all fell off. So in the offseason, the Hornets did a swap of Emeka Okafor for Tyson Chandler. Not a big difference. They're honestly about the same exact type of player. Emeka played all 82 games. He averaged 10 points and 9 rebounds, along with 2 blocks per game, 53% from the field. So basically the exact same type of thing as what Tyson Chandler was giving them. And then um, when you go to look at the other players on the team, you had David West played 81 games, again, played pretty well. 19 points per game, 8 rebounds, the same sort of deal. Over 50% from the field, which is good. And then Stojakovic, again, missed 20 games like the season before, and now you're really seeing him to slow down at 32 years old. His field goal percentage is only at 40%, which is pretty low for him. Also, instead of shooting normally like he does in the 40s from 3, he's down to 38%, which isn't a huge difference, but it is lower, so that's something to note. He's averaging 13 points per game. And then the big one, which is the big difference in this season, that Chris Paul missed half the season. He only played in 45 games. He did still have good statistics, 49% from the field, 41% from 3, which is really good for him. Averaged 19 points per game, 11 rebounds, 11 assists, 4 rebounds, 2 steals per game. And we saw some young guys really start to really develop and play well. 2 rookies specifically. Darren Collison, who filled in for Chris Paul, he scored 12 points per game on 48% shooting from the field and 40% from 3, which is really good. And then Marcus Thornton, who averaged 15 points per game on 45% shooting. So that's the difference for this New Orleans team. If they didn't have those kind of surprise, really good performances from the rookies in Marcus Thornton and Darren Collison, they would have been a lot worse than the 37 wins that they had. But because they had those surprising performances, they weren't able to bottom out and get a high draft pick. They were stuck with let's see here. They were stuck with around the 11th pick instead of, if they would have had those guys play awfully and stuff, they probably would have been more around 30 wins, and they would have probably had like the 7th or 8th pick, which it doesn't sound like a big deal, but it can make a huge difference as far as the players that are available to you and the improvement that that can have on your team. Either way, this would have been a great season to tank for this team with Chris Paul not really playing much, but instead they basically still went for it, and the result was that they just ended up in no man's land in the middle with a 37 win record. Okay, and now on to 2010 to 11, Chris Paul's last year in New Orleans. So again, a competitive Western Conference, which doesn't help. Let's see here. Let's see all the records. Again, the worst team in the playoffs won 46 games. And the difference between the 5 seed and the 8 seed was 4 games, which is a big difference when you consider that a lot of times teams just don't consider dropping 1 or 2 games can make a huge difference on your playoff seeding and your record and just how your season goes. And so that can be hard to remember. But what did we get this year? We got a healthy Chris Paul, which is good. He played 80 games. He averaged 16 points per game, 10 assists, 2 steals, 46% from the field, 39% from 3. So a pretty good season overall. And then you had, again, Emeka Okafor. He played in 72 games, so still relatively healthy. He averaged 10 and 10, which is good. 2 blocks per game, 57% from the field. And then David West, who, again, also relatively healthy. 70 games he played. He averaged 19 and 8. Again, pretty good. 51% from the field for shooting. And then we had a few new additions here, which is kind of cool to see. We had Darren Collison, who was traded, but in free agency, not Pelicans, Hornets signed Trevor Ariza, who averaged 11 points per game for them. Was a good wing defender. And then they also picked up Carl Landry, who was a good bench guy. He only played in 23 games, but still good player. And then they also got Jarrett Jack and Marco Bellinelli as supporting pieces, and Jarrett Jack is a bench guy. They were both pretty decent players. Peja Stojakovic was a big difference this season in a negative way, in that he only played in 6 games. This was the dude who they had been looking at as their 3rd best player for the last couple of seasons, and now he basically was not even on the team this year, and that made a big difference in that they were initially going to use Trevor Ariza more as like a really good like sixth man off the bench dude, but because of Stojakovic missing the whole year, they had to have him start, and then their bench was a lot weaker. Um, and so yeah, just basically losing Peja this year was a big deal, and that's about 18 to 16 points per game that they were losing that they had to replace with a combination of Marco Bellinelli and Jarrett Jack, which yes, they're decent role players, but they're not as good as Peja Stojakovic. So they won 46 games. They were the 7th seed. They played the Lakers in the playoffs, and this Lakers team was just a lot better. Overall, they had Kobe healthy. They had basically everybody healthy, and the New Orleans, they weren't unhealthy in the playoffs, but again, they didn't have Stojakovic, who that made a huge difference. And then they actually didn't have David West in the playoffs because the injury that he sustained was later in the season. So they went into the series with Okafor, Chris Paul, Trevor Ariza, and then a now healthy Carl Landry starting instead. And that really just wasn't enough in that basically it was Chris Paul and Ariza versus the Lakers. And yes, Carl Landry's a good player, and in the void of David West, he'd put up 15 points per game. And yes, Emeka Okafor is a good starter, but he also is pigeonholed in that he's a specific thing. He's never going to have a night where he gives you like 25 if you need it. He's going to give you 10 and 10 every night, and he's just locked into that position. So that's really it, guys. After this season, New Orleans, they were going to just basically go back to the drawing board and try and do the same thing and be about a 45 to 48 win team and try and make the playoffs. But they again just were kind of directionless. So they ended up taking the deal with the Clippers to trade Chris Paul for Eric Gordon, Chris Kaman, and Al-Farouq Aminu. And the rest is sort of history. They blew it up. They got Anthony Davis, and now they're the New Orleans Pelicans, and they're about to do the same thing with Anthony Davis. If I had to sum up though some of the main reasons this Pelicans era failed, or excuse me, this Hornets era failed, it would be injuries was a big thing in that Peja was missing games, and Tyson Chandler was missing games at times, and Chris Paul was missing half a season one year, and in a Western Conference that was so tight as far as the margin for error, those injuries really just took them out of a lot of contention in the years following 2008. Um, Another big thing that I just mentioned right there was the parity in the West and just how good so many teams were in that at any given year you had to basically worry about 10 teams in the West, and in a different time frame this New Orleans team would maybe be a perennial like 3 seed like what the Blazers are now or something like that, but just because this conference was so stacked and they just had no margin for error, and so if they dropped 1 or 2 games here or there, that would be the difference for them between the 2 seed and like the 7 seed, and so they just didn't have it really with the injuries also. And then lastly, I think a big thing that kind of gets swept under the rug is this team. Yes, they had a nice starting lineup, but they had really no depth for a lot of their run during this time frame. They had Chris Paul, and they had David West, and they had Peja, but outside of that, they really didn't have anyone who you could consistently rely on to score. Because a lot of like Okafor and Tyson Chandler's scoring was just based on like cleaning up the boards and getting offensive rebounds and getting putbacks and stuff like that. So that's not like a consistent way of scoring in that it's variable to what the rebounds are that night. And they also didn't have ever like a consistent wing scorer. Like Peja Stojakovic would score, but it was all off of being assisted on and just being like a catch and shoot player. They didn't really have a guy that you could just trust to take the ball and create his own offense. Yes, Chris Paul, but if somebody puts like a 6'6" defender on him, that can really limit what he's able to do just because of him being only 6 feet tall. But yeah, so those are some of the reasons to quickly recap: injuries, parity, and just limited player availability, and that they just didn't have the guys compared to some of the other Western Conference teams who had a lot better depth and players. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Hope you found it informative. Hope you found it interesting. If you guys have any comments or questions about this, feel free to leave them below in the comment section. And hope you guys have a good day. Bye.